With three major GOP primaries in the rearview mirror and one still too close to call, many are asking where the GOP stands heading into the midterms. Joining us now to discuss that is Chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, Ronna McDaniel. Chairwoman, good to see you, and thank you so much for coming on here. I want to get into the politics of it all, but I do want to get your response to as well as what happened, the tragedy in Uvalde, 19 children, 2 adults, their lives were taken after a gunman stormed Robb Elementary School there. Can't help but to see so many politicians already jumping in. You may have seen Beto O'Rourke jumping into a press conference with Governor Greg Abbott, the mayor of Uvalde as well. Is it the time for politics in what we've seen so far during this tragedy?
I think, first of all of our hearts grieve with these families. I think of my son who's in school right now. He's had a lot of anxiety after watching this shooting. We had one in Oxford, Michigan earlier in the year. It affects our kids. Every family's having these discussions. I do think it's time to think about the families and the mourning of that community. We are inundated with politics all day, every day. We will have time for that later. Right now, it's about how do we support these families, come together, put our politics aside, and think about this community. And I think what Beto O'Rourke did yesterday was uncalled for. He did it to score political points instead of trying to mourn with a grieving community.
Yeah, he's a gubernatorial candidate there in Texas, again, interrupting that press conference there. We're going to show that later in the show. I'll move now to the primaries. Obviously, a lot of focus was on the GOP. We'll move state by state. I'll start with Georgia Secretary of State, the gubernatorial race, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Herschel Walker winning his primary, obviously, there for Senate. I want to talk to you about that. Some of these there in Georgia. What stood out to you the most? You know that Trump endorsed David Perdue. The incumbent, Brian Kemp, pulled that one out, and that primary there. As far as addressing that from a GOP standpoint, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about the Trump endorsement and where the GOP stands today?
So when I look at Georgia, there's a couple things that really stand out. One, we had record turnout. We doubled turnout from the 2018 primary on the Republican side. We also saw record turnout with African American, Hispanic, and Asian voters on the GOP side. That bodes really well heading into November. I think that too much is being made about endorsements in Georgia when the overriding figure in this primary was Stacey Abrams, a gubernatorial candidate who just said Georgia's the worst state to live in. I think Republicans looked at Kemp as somebody who's beaten her before and thought he would be the best as the incumbent governor to take her on. I say this often. I talk to Georgians all the time. They love President Trump, but they want to beat Stacey Abrams, and they didn't view it as an either or. They thought Kemp was the best person to do that. They obviously supported President Trump's endorsement of Herschel Walker, who won overwhelmingly. And we've seen that across the country with his endorsements, how powerful they've been.
Can Herschel Walker win in a general?
He can. Absolutely, he can. There's polling that already has him up. He is incredibly likable. He is somebody who's a hometown hero, but he also is focusing on bringing people together and focusing on Georgians and their issues. And what we've seen from Democrats like Warnock is a doubling down on division. We're seeing it right now. Everything they do is about dividing our country, dividing us, creating anger, creating fear. And I think Herschel is a very uplifting, optimistic candidate who really can win in November.
Yeah, he would face off against Raphael Warnock there. Let's move on to Pennsylvania, if I can. A recount underway. This has been one to watch. McCormick, Dr. Oz. You know, McCormick is currently pursuing litigation in court to have a number of undated mail-in ballots counted. How do you feel about that as far as where Pennsylvania stands, the recount, and McCormick's lawsuit there to have those ballots counted?
Well, I think either of them can win that race. I think they're both great candidates. I really like Oz. I really like McCormick. Oz is up by 952 ballots right now. There's going to be a recount. It'll start, I think, tomorrow, and it has to be done by June 7th. I will say I'm not a fan of counting undated ballots. That's against Pennsylvania law. I'm worried of a slippery slope that if we allow the law to be changed after the primary, the Democrats will pounce on that and use that in November and say, oh, now we don't need a secrecy ballot. Now we don't need undated ballots, or we can count undated ballots. The RNC has been heavily invested in making sure laws are upheld and that states abide by the laws on their books, and we think that Pennsylvania should do the same.
A final question for you really quickly here. I want to ask you about this. Obviously, there are different campaign topics that will come up in these midterms, rather, abortion rights, et cetera. But another one now seems to be the Second Amendment, right, with what happened there in Texas. You've seen it. President Biden recently spoke about the Second Amendment, and he says that the Second Amendment is not absolute. How does the Republican Party feel about that, in your opinion? Final thoughts on that, and do you see that being a platform to run on for Democrats that come midterms?
Yeah, I think our founders were very clear and very right in giving us the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. And I think we need to keep guns out of the hands of bad people and mentally ill and deranged people. And I think that's a state issue. You saw Florida adjust some of their laws after Parkland. You saw President Trump expand the background checks, get rid of bump stocks. There are things that we need to be talking about, but we have to look at the whole picture of mental health, these violent video games, isolation coming out of the pandemic. So many factors lead into this. Let's let the investigation take place. We know that Democrats have already jumped ahead and tried to make this a political issue while our whole nation is mourning. It would have been nice if Joe Biden used that moment to lead a nation in mourning and bring us together instead of once again trying to divide.
All right, we'll leave it right there. That is the GOP Chairwoman Ronna McDaniel joining us live on the program. Ronna, good to see you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, we're real news for real people.